Okay, so hi everyone. For the purposes of admissions, this is philosophy and cognitive science, and today we're going to be talking about reinforcement learning. So we ran through attendance a moment ago, so I just kind of wanted to run a couple of logistical things by you. First of all, I've been looking at your homeworks and you're, for the most part, doing a good job. Some of you, maybe just because of coronavirus and being on Zoom, are kind of falling down and doing your homeworks a little bit. I know it can be tricky because you're not getting them back physically. So just remember that they are being graded. So just kind of hang in there for the last couple of weeks. Make sure you keep doing them because our TA, Annabeth, is marking those and checking to make sure you're doing those. The other thing I wanted to say was that some of you have started getting back your rough drafts. I'm doing those on a kind of first come, first serve. So in the order that you submitted them, I'm reading them and returning them back to you. You'll notice if you have started getting your rough drafts back, there's a lot of comments on them. So I do spend quite a lot of time on them. And so it is taking me a bit of time. And to that end, I wanted to extend the deadline for the final paper. So the paper is currently due on April the 21st. And to kind of give you a bit of breathing room once you get your paper back, we'll do it for April 27th. So push it back by however many days, 6 days there to give you a bit of time. So what you'll do there is you'll just be due at 5 o'clock. You'll send it to me by email just the way that you did with your rough drafts. I just kind of, I do like to give a lot of feedback on them, so it's just taking me a little bit longer because, which is a good thing, a lot of you chose to do the optional rough draft, so I'm just kind of turning those back as I can. Any questions about that? Vindia, is that a hand?
Sorry, I'm also looking at the calendar. So will our midterm also be that week on the 30th?
It will be on the 30th, yeah. Yeah, so that's why I hadn't scheduled it that way originally, but since we got thrown off by a few weeks and yeah, it's just all a bit delayed. Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, you'll want to mind your time management there a bit. Yeah, that was a good question. Hey, Caroline, I'm going to add you to the attendance. Noah, are you here, by the way? Okay. Okay, so today we're going to kind of continue our dive into reinforcement learning. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is kind of a pop quiz question. What's the swan poem at the beginning? So there's a poem about a swan at the beginning of the chapter. What's up with that? Here, I'll let you read it. What's this about? What is this doing there? This is on the first page of the chapter that we have for today. Somebody want to read it for us? Philippe, do you want to read it for us?
Oh, is that the one? I was looking at the preface with the "if I could, I would reach beyond," but
let's read this one because I want to ask you guys if you can put together why it's there. It's just kind of a funny curiosity.
Okay, so start at jet.
Yep.
Okay, jet exhaust shimmers above the tarmac. I remember the strengths of swans on the lake up north, their wings stretching forward, beating back. Acceleration pushes us into our seats, and we lift into the sky.
Okay. What is this about? Ava?
So I remember later in I don't remember which chapter, if it was 2 or 3, but he talks about how the mechanisms of a bird's flight versus an airplane. And he says even though they're so different, they utilize the same physical properties of air in order to fly. So I guess this is kind of putting both of those together and creating a bridge of sort.
Yeah, and why is that kind of a useful foreshadowing for what the chapter is going to be about, or what the 2 chapters are about?
I talked a lot about like the thermostat and like explaining the goals and decisions that the thermostat might make. And like, even though obviously human brains are a lot more complicated than that, it's the same overall concept of receiving feedback and then changing the decision, going back to like the point that they wanted.
Yeah, so David Reddish is kind of an awesome neuroscientist. He also likes to start his book chapters with little poems that he wrote. And this is the poem that he wrote for these 2 chapters. And I think you, Ava and Ashley, are absolutely hitting the nail on the head. So part of it is that we can learn from machines to understand how the mind works, right? This is an idea that we've kind of been exploring all semester. Okay, fine. We can probably swallow that. I think that's not that weird at this point. But I also think that here where he's saying, you know, they're beating back. It's kind of like the air to the wings is kind of like the negative feedback is to the mind. I think that's what he's getting at there, is that it's kind of this like reverse cyclical process that drives learning and that drives decision making. So I think that's what he's getting at there, is that what lifts us, in other words, what allows us to learn, is this kind of negative feedback loop of learning that he's going to explain in the thermostat. So yeah, so this is just kind of a handy way for me to see you know, how the reading went, and if you guys were able to connect that. I also think it's just a really kooky way for him to start a chapter. So I just wanted to kind of flag that. Reddish is a brilliant scientist, but he's also kind of a wonderful human being. So I thought that was kind of a sweet way for him to start the chapters with poems that he wrote. So today we're basically going to divide things into 2 parts. We're going to wrap up the kind of conceptual introduction to reinforcement learning, which is tied to the Sutton and Bardo chapter that we read for last class. And then we're going to switch gears and we're going to start applying this conceptual level analysis to the mind. So here you can kind of think of the levels that we've been talking about. You have the conceptual level, then maybe you have a computational or mathematical level, then you have a neural level, then you have a behavioral level, and then maybe you have an economic level, right? This is what we saw in our kind of 3D space of cognitive science. And so we're going to kind of work through these levels to understand decision-making in the mind over the next couple of classes. And so what we have in the Sutton and Bardo is just kind of a conceptual overview. Like here's like a coarse-grained description of how we think this works. And then when we shift to Reddish, he's not actually going to take these levels in order. So he's going to start with the behavioral, right? Behavioral kind of revealed preferences and decision making. And then he's going to kind of take a step back and down and explore it at the neural level in order to show us how the neural levels produce the behavioral level patterns of decision making. So does that kind of interaction make sense? So we're not exactly doing the levels in order the way that we've been talking about them so far, but we're keeping all these levels in mind and trying to fit all the pieces together. Philippe?
Say the 5 levels again.
So I would say, so it's like at the top is like just conceptual. We're just going to talk about it in terms of the main ideas. Like this is what we're after in reinforcement learning. Here are the main premises, the main definitions and things like that. It's just kind of an overview. Then if you were a reinforcement learner in computer science, you kind of move down a level to the mathematical. So reinforcement learners typically work with numbers and formulas or computations. So that's kind of a mathematical level description. Then they work closely with neuroscientists who work primarily at the neural level, either at the systems or kind of cognitive neuroscience levels. Then neuroscientists often work with psychologists or cognitive neuroscientists who work with the behavioral patterns that these decision-making processes produce. And they work closely with economists and neuroeconomists who kind of try to see how the brain informs the ways that we behave. Right? So we kind of go through these kinds of levels, and what we're going to see today is we're going to kind of wrap up our conceptual overview, but then although Reddish is a neuroscientist, we're going to skip to the behavioral level and describe our decision-making patterns and how weird they are, and then we're going to kind of come back and do a deep dive into the neural levels and see how our neural systems produce these sometimes weird decision-making patterns. So does that give you kind of a lay of the land of how today is going to work and how generally the thing will be organized. Any questions about that? Okay, I'm scrolling through here to see how everyone's doing. Okay, so let's kind of dive in, right? So let me share the slides here. And we'll start. Okay, so can everyone see the slides? Yeah, cool. So remember we asked kind of like, predictive coding has a general project of explaining what the mind is doing in general, right? And remind me, what did predictive coders think that the mind does? I'm gonna go with Joe on this one.
It tries to minimize error.
Sorry, say that, yeah, minimize error. That's right? So for a predictive coder, anything that the mind is doing can be explained in terms of prediction error minimization, right? And last class, we talked a little bit about perception and action and cognition in those terms. The question for reinforcement learners is much narrower. They're not trying to explain what the mind does overall. They're just trying to answer one kind of much more specific question, which is how do agents learn? And in particular, how do they perform this one specific kind of learning, which is learning through interactions with the environment, right? So you can remember from your reading, what are the different ways that an agent might learn? We learn in a bunch of different ways in life. What are they? How are you learning right now? Louise?
By looking at something.
Okay, you're looking at something. Okay, that's an important way of learning. Kiara?
Conditional learning, like positive, negative reinforcement.
Yeah, conditioned learning. So like if I reward you guys with good grades or something like that, that reinforces certain patterns of action. Are you alone? Are you doing this all alone?
Or supervised learning.
Yeah, exactly, right? So there are different classes of learning. Some classes of learning are called supervised, right? And that's because there's a teacher and the teacher is telling you how to do something. Now that's not really the case in college anymore, but like supervised learning is, for example, if I take up woodworking tomorrow, which I would never do, but if I take up woodworking tomorrow, I'm gonna have a teacher and the teacher is gonna show me how to use the tool on the wood to achieve a certain kind of result. Right? That's a class of learning. Reinforcement learners are not, it's not that it's not interesting, but they're not interested in that class of learning. They're interested in learning just through interactions with the environment. So they're very influenced by the work of people like Tolman, who we read earlier in the semester, where they just want to see how the brain learns only through interactions with the environment, right? Does anybody remember the plover example that we talked about last class? What was the story with the plover? Here in the picture. Eva?
So if I remember correctly, that little bird, like a couple of hours, I think, after it's born, it knows how to do pretty much everything. And the parents don't teach it anything specifically, but it knows how to detect danger or find food and all the little things that it needs to survive.
Yeah, it just kind of bumps around in the world and then it figures out, oh, hey, food was over here and water is over here and that big scary seagull is over there and I want to avoid that. And the question is, how do plovers do that? How do rodents do that? How do we do that? What are the mechanisms that enable us to learn in that way? And in reinforcement learning, the way that we do that is we break that problem down with all its kind of complexities of the beach and the bird and things like that. And we really strip the problem down into some of its core elements. So we strip it down to some really, really basic ingredients. And those are as follows, right? So we have the agent. That can be a plover, that can be a robot, that can be a computer program, that can be a human being. Then there are states, which is kind of like the parts of the world that the agent can be in. So in a very simplified version, we can represent it here in a kind of grid world. Our little plover can be in 12 possible states. Then we have action. So the plover can act in 4 different ways in our little world here. So what actions are available to the plover in our little grid world here based on your reading? What can our little plover do? It can go
move to the grasshopper or whatever that is.
Yeah, so if you really strip things down, right? Yeah, so this is a grasshopper and they're roughly the same size, but don't worry about that. Our little plover can go up, it can go down, it can go left, and it can go right. That's it. It's got 4 action possibilities, right? And what the plover, or in this case, our computer simulation of a plover needs to do is to figure out, okay, how should I act so that I get my reward, right? And we'll talk about what a reward is in a second. So let's say that we start off our plover here. Should the plover go left? We all roughly agree. Should it go up?
No.
No, right, it should go something like this, right? Now remember, let's say that the plover has just been born. It doesn't know what it's supposed to do. Like it doesn't even know that the grasshopper is there. So what it needs to do is it needs to kind of try and just move around, kind of bump around in the world. And the first time it bumps into a grasshopper, it's like, oh crap, that was awesome. I got a reward. And it needs to learn something about the states that it was in the past that led it to the grasshopper. I'm going to say something about that in a second, but just to kind of briefly introduce the idea, in reinforcement learning, the central idea is you learn backwards. First, you experience something really good or really bad, and you learn about your world retroactively, insofar as it led up to the good thing or the bad thing. Now, to kind of show you how that idea works, we need a couple of more concepts here. And for that, we have a reward and a function. And those two are kind of technical terms. So I want to show you what those two mean specifically in reinforcement learning, because as you know from today's reading, value gets taken up in a lot of different ways. So the definition of reward is the intrinsic desirability of a given state or state action pair. Now, does anyone remember from the reading what something that's intrinsically desirable means? I'm going to go with Emily. What does it mean for something to just be intrinsically desirable?
Does that mean that like by nature they're like attracted to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a plover, the grasshopper is intrinsically desirable. Right? Now, what are some things that are intrinsically desirable for you guys?
Like food and water.
Okay, food and water. What else? What is the first thing you're going to eat when you leave quarantine?
Pizza, ice cream.
Pizza,
Everything.
ice cream. What's that?
I said just like everything. Like
yeah, everything. Yeah. What's the first thing you're going to do?
like see people.
Okay, see people. What else?
Like go to different places that are open.
Yeah, you're going to leave your house.
Yeah.
Okay, so things that are rewarding for us are just things that are good in and of themselves, right? Cake, going to the movies, seeing our friends. Those are the things that we enjoy, right? And that they kind of give us all kinds of physiological and psychological responses, and they're just things that we seek out. Now, a value is something that's valuable is really closely related to a reward, but it's slightly different. Value is the total expected future reward associated with a given state or state action pair. Now that can sound kind of confusing, but it's not really. It's really easy. It's if we go back to this example of the grasshopper being here, right? The grasshopper is rewarding, but if we start the plover here in this grid space, in this state and this state are both valuable because they lead to the grasshopper. So things are valuable insofar as they lead to rewarding things down the road. Any questions about that? So getting that distinction right will be really helpful for the next couple of classes. So any kind of first pass questions there, Kiara? Oh, and if you guys want to use the manual like Zoom hand raise, just to make sure I see everyone. Kiara?
Can we go back to the other slide with the definition?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
No worries. Any questions about the difference? Ava? Yep. And then Thomas?
I need
Thank
to
you,
unmute. Okay, so I was gonna ask, so you said that each movement in the grid would be valuable, but the reward happens at the very last move, right? When it gets to the grasshopper? Okay.
Yeah, so not every state would be valuable. So let's say that the best way to go to, so the raven can go either like this, so like taking the lower road, or the higher road. Now that means that the states that lead to the grasshopper are valuable, but for example, this top state is not valuable because it's not on the way, unless the plover goes this way, right? So it can become valuable if it eventually leads to the grasshopper, but it's less valuable than this state or this state because they almost always lead to the grasshopper.
Okay.
Right? Does that help? Okay. Thomas?
Okay, so is the value function more of a like a long-term concept, and reward is like an immediate desire?
Yeah, so one thing that you can think about is that both the rewards and the values live in our heads, right? Because we don't think grasshoppers are particularly rewarding, but the plover does. But the value is a way of guiding action on the way to rewards. So let me give you an example. I love coffee. This will not come as a surprise to any of you, as I often come to this class with a cup of coffee. I love coffee. So for me, coffee is rewarding. But to get the cup of coffee, I sometimes have to get out of bed. Sucks. I have to grind the coffee, which is sucky. I have to boil the water, which is sucky. I have to get the mug, which is usually dirty. And notice that none of the things that I've just described are rewarding at all. In fact, they're crappy. They're punishing, kind of. Certainly getting out of bed is punishing. But those are valuable states because they lead to the reward.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that we assign value and that we assign reward, in fact, is going to be the kind of central construct that we use to explain how we learn, like what the world is like and what states are good and what states are bad. And then also it's going to inform which states we want to be in, which states we want to avoid. In other words, how we decide what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, what we're going to eat and what we're not going to eat, what we're going to drink and what we're not going to drink. Right? Like I don't like milk. That's because it's punishing for me, but I'm also going to avoid all the things that lead to my drinking milk because that's disgusting. Right? And so if you can understand how this overlay of reward and value works, you can start to see that the world that we engage in is kind of overlain with reward and value for us. And that kind of guides how we act and how we decide, how we gamble, how we make choices, things like that. Joe.
So basically, your value function is what is going to lead to your reward, right?
So there's going to be a reward signal and a value function. And so far we've just been talking about reward and value. So let's say that this state has a value of 3. The value function is actually going to be the mathematical function that you use to calculate how to get from a reward of, say, 5 over here. Or let's say we really like crickets, okay? Crickets are the best thing that ever happened to this plover. So we know that we get a reward of 100 points here. The value function is going to be the mathematical algorithm that allows us to go from receiving 100 points to learning that this state is worth, let's say, 30. So there's going to be an actual mathematical function that describes this backward motion of learning. And that's why we call it a function. Because what reinforcement learning tried to do was to figure out what the optimal way of making these calculations or making these attributions is. Okay, so we can look at this in a kind of an example. Basically, reinforcement learning methods are any mathematical methods that have a value function, precisely as Joe asked. And they roughly all have the following thing in common. They work retroactively. So let's say that I had never had coffee for the first time. There was once such a day. And I really resisted coffee when I was in undergrad. And then one day someone gave me an espresso. And it was like 11 o'clock at night. So it was particularly exciting. And so I didn't attach any value to boiling water. I didn't attach any value to coffee beans, any value to grinding coffee, because to me it didn't lead to anything, right? I mean, obviously boiling water leads to lots of things. So just kind of go with the example here, but I had never had this reward. Now, once I had coffee for the first time, I was like bouncing off the walls and I thought it was the best thing ever. And basically, I was attributing this reward backwards to the valuable states. So I started attributing value to grinding coffee, to buying coffee beans, to boiling water, and so on. And there are a number of mathematical solutions that describe how the mind or how a computer can do this. And one of the most famous ones is called the temporal difference learning algorithm, which basically has kind of a running average and essentially bootstraps in the way that the thermostat does, which we'll talk about in a second, this kind of running tally of the value of different states. But don't have my copy of it here, but if you're interested, that book, Reinforcement Learning, that we read the first chapter of is basically a textbook of mathematical solutions for how to solve this problem of having a reward here and then attributing value backwards to states. Okay. Any other questions about that, kind of just as a broad sketch? Oh, sorry, huge number of questions here. So Ashley, then Helen, and then Philippe.
So are the numbers within these boxes mathematically computed, or are they just random numbers that you like assigned for this?
Okay, so in this example, they work out, but I just made these up in this case. But depending on what implementation you're in, they're going to look different. So do you guys all remember what the implementation level explanation is from Mar? So in a computer simulation, so reinforcement learning is originally a branch of computer science. So all of this would be represented numerically. So yeah, it would just be numbers. But in a discovery I'll describe in a second, it turns out that these same mathematical algorithms made really nice predictions about dopamine firing in the brain. And so it wouldn't be represented in numbers in the brain anymore, but it might be represented in terms of neural firing patterns or dopamine firing patterns. If I build a robot, it's probably going to be represented in like electrical signals, so on. So depending on what system you're in, it will get represented differently. But because this was originally a branch of computer science and basically math, we did it with numbers, and then it turned out that those numbers were actually useful in nature, but we didn't expect that initially.
So
Does that help?
Is the higher the number, the more the individual values it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that we'll talk about later is something like we also assign value to or reward to ideas and moral ideas, for example. And so people have a stronger reward signal for something like, I think it's wrong to murder, than for something like, I think it's wrong to jaywalk. And you can put them in an fMRI and you can see which question they're looking at just by the strength of the reward signal. Yeah, great question. Helen is next.
Okay, so are these values like continuous? That makes sense? Like, are they always changing depending upon, because you don't just make coffee once, so like, does that change somehow if one day you wake up and you're really excited to grind that coffee? Like, do these values change numerically based on your state of mind?
That's a great question, and one that's subject to a lot of debate, and a lot of what you think about this depends on which field you come from. So integration problem. So if you come from reinforcement learning, you kind of think of the numbers as sticky. So you like coffee, and then if you have more coffee, the numbers slowly go up, and if you have coffee you don't like, it slowly goes down. If you come to this question from neuroeconomics, you think that you probably calculate the value of the coffee every time. So notice that if you have coffee in the morning, it's worth a lot. If you have coffee at night, it's going to keep you up at night. So it's actually kind of a low reward or even a punishing phenomenon. And so there's some just disciplinary debate as to exactly how much is learned and stored versus how much is calculated online every time. And we don't actually completely know the answer to that question. Yeah, so that's a good question. But I think the basic idea that you can think of is that with every interaction, you're basically adjusting it a little bit. So you can think of, for example, Bayes' rule. Some people think that we may also be using Bayes' rule here a little bit. We have kind of a running prior as to what our value of something is, and then we adjust it a little bit with each occasion, but it doesn't kind of override our preferences every time. Does that make sense? Okay. I think Philippe was next.
I have 2 questions. First, on the grid, where the plover could make a decision to go straight or to go, what was it, like left? Yeah, so.
Yeah, right or down. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If those 2 boxes both have the same value, how does the plover make a choice?
Great question. So it depends on whether it's been here before or not. So early on in a kind of process, one thing that you can do is you can just make it probabilistic. So supposing that we don't know anything about the world yet, and we'll put the cricket back down here. Up here, right, if this is the plover's first time in the world, it doesn't know. And so one thing that you might do is you might say, well, make it stochastic, or give it a 25% distribute, or like whatever, right? You can put it here, and it can have a 25% chance of going north, south, east, and west. First pass. But then things can get more complicated. So there's a tension here between, when you're learning, how much you should explore your environment and learn new things about it, versus once you do find a reward, whether you should just sit there and exploit it. Right? So supposing that the plover finds the cricket for the first time, and it's like, ooh, cricket, right? And then you reset it. Now, if it's going to exploit, it could just go to the cricket every single time. But it might miss out on the fact that, in fact, in a state it's never explored, it's Cricket City over here. And so here, we haven't talked about this yet, but it's not just a question of how to learn about the world, it's a question of policy making. So learning which actions to take in which states, following what rules, so that you maximize reward over time, or in other words, value. And again, there are multiple solutions. There's no one single mathematical solution to it, depending on the state of, or the nature of the agent, the nature of the environment. Different mathematical solutions have different strengths and weaknesses, and they kind of tell you, okay, here you should exploit, here you should explore, here you should have a fixed policy and things like that, right? So there are lots of different solutions. Now, the one thing, Philippe, I'll note before I come to your second question is that what we think of as choosing is about to take a nosedive, because it's not that the plover is standing there and thinking, well, this has a value of X and Y, and this has a value of X and Y. It just subpersonally, subconsciously, mechanistically computes the value and goes to the highest one. Right, so it turns out that what we choose is in fact guided by these numerical representations of value, but we can get into that as we go. What was your second question?
I actually developed a different second question. I'll leave the other question for like slack. Thinking about choice as like a two-directional road. So for example, like where the plover is, like if it decided to go one way or the other. Would it be possible to say that whichever choice the plover, like every single choice the plover makes is equal? Like even if the plover went in a direction where it would take more steps, there's some form of like there's something that makes it equal, because if it wasn't equal, it wouldn't be a choice.
They're not equal. And yeah, this is kind of what I'm starting to get at. So one of the ways that we set up our simulations, for example, when I write simulations for my little moral agents, is I actually make each step cost a tiny little bit, because so I every step is like minus 0.01 reward, just because I don't want my goddamn plover to wander around like ad infinitum. Like I want it to finish the episode. So I make it a little bit costly, just like being in the world is a little bit costly when you're an organic creature. I make it a little bit costly. So the first way to say that they're not equal is the longer you take, the slightly more you paid to get to that cricket or something like that. But the other thing that I would say is that we define it in terms of optimality. So what you're trying to do, so when we ask the question of how do you learn by interaction with the environment, the very coarse-grained conceptual answer that reinforcement learning provides about computers and or computers that care, organic creatures like us, human agents and things like that, is we learn by interacting, by maximizing accumulated reward over time. And if you do that less efficiently, then we call you worse at that. Yeah. Bearing in mind that sometimes it's worth exploring your environment and you don't immediately get rewarded for that. But over time, you want to strike a balance between, say, explore and exploit so that you maximize reward. Yeah, so we would just call that worse. Pretty stone coldly worse. Yeah. Good question. I think there was another question from Priya. Sorry, Priya, I know you've been very patient.
I had a question regarding like both predictive learning and predicting coding and reinforcement learning. So do they both kind of correlate to like evolutionary fitness in a way?
I think broadly you could argue that they certainly do, right? So one of the ways that people describe reinforcement learning certainly is to say, like, okay, we've had this tradition, right, of saying that the mind is a machine, right? That's what we've been looking at since day one with Turing. But in the 90s, people were like, yeah, but the thing is my MacBook doesn't care and I do, right? What is that? What is that caring? And people think that that caring comes from this attribution of reward and value, because what we're trying to do is not die, right? Consistent with the theory of evolution, what we're constantly trying to do is survive. And the reason that we look at the world in terms of better and worse, or reward and value, is because we're constantly assessing, is this better or worse for my survival? And that's the difference between us and our IBM. Now notice that what we've learned since 1990, when this reinforcement learning really started taking off, is that this kind of caring really makes computation efficient. And so what we're doing now is we're putting what we've borrowed from animals and what we've borrowed from ourselves, we're putting it back into computers. So do you guys remember talking about AlphaGo at the beginning of the semester? The reason AlphaGo works so well is because it uses reinforcement learning methods to learn how to play Go. So now we're teaching our computers to care in the way that it seems that our minds care, and that's giving them kind of newfound computational abilities. But yeah, these approaches should be squarely consistent with evolution, because they should be consistent with kind of survival. Now, in terms of predictive coding, I think that's efficient with or consistent with evolution in a different way, which is that evolution really values efficiency and trimming the fat, kind of. And predictive coding is very efficient from an information processing perspective, because rather than taking all of this new information in constantly, all you do is you take in the errors. And that's way more efficient than the kind of bottom-up approach that we used to think that we used. So I think that would be kind of a different different argument from evolution. But yeah, you could argue that they're consistent that way. Make sense? Does that help? Does that get at the question?
Yes, that helped. Thank you.
Awesome. Does anyone else have a hand or question? I'm trying to scoot through here. Okay. So yeah, basically Rich Sutton and Andrew Bartow were computer scientists. They were like, can we design little computer programs that can learn? And they developed all these algorithms that allowed the plover to kind of bump around in this little grid world, or it's sometimes called a Markov decision process. And then in 1997, as I mentioned, we discovered that these same mathematical algorithms that we thought were just kind of for computers only actually did really predict the firing patterns of the dopamine system. And so all of a sudden we had a very nice moment in cognitive science where computation actually predicted something in the brain. And basically computational neuroscience gets born, and neuroeconomics gets born. And we start to take all of that math to describe organic creatures. And we also start using all these organic creatures to design the kinds of artificial intelligence that we see at Google and DeepMind today. Now, one of the people who participated in this was David Reddish. And so with that, I kind of want to switch, and I feel like I've tried to give you kind of a conceptual overview of like the mathematical approach to these problems, and now I want to kind of switch and see how it actually applies to the human mind. So I guess kind of first pass, like, in what sense, okay, so this is kind of didactic, but in what sense is Reddish a cognitive scientist in the way that we've talked about today? What are some of the features of cognitive science that we've been talking about, and how does he sort of embody those? You can just call out, because I think I can't see all of you at the same time at the moment.
He spends a lot of time writing about bridging disciplines.
Okay, a lot of time talking about bridging disciplines. And which disciplines is he bridging here?
He talks a lot about AI and a lot about economics.
Yeah, AI, economics, and a couple others. One is the giveaway, right? Because he's talking about the brain.
Neuroscience and psychology.
Yeah, neuroscience and psychology, right? Maybe a dash of philosophy in there for good measure. But basically our core disciplines going forward are going to be computation, right, or computer science, economics, because economics is also really interested in kind of mathematical approaches, neuroscience, because we're like, holy shit, some of this computer science works, and then psychology, because we're interested in the behaviors that go with that brain activity, right? Great. In what other senses does he kind of work as a perfect model of a cognitive scientist, as we've been talking about it so far? What are some other things that you guys noticed?
I'd say he's presenting a model on how we can study the brain and learning and our behaviors. And he's using, I guess, machines and mechanical processes to explain and kind of go back and forth and say if a machine can think like a man or can be programmed, so maybe we also work the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. So this crazy idea that we get with Turing, right, and then we get with broadband and information processing, that's now a background assumption of how we're studying decision making and addiction, right? It's just kind of ingrained. It's in the lineage now of how we study the mind. So yeah, that's a great observation. Any other ones? Star?
He talks a lot about like efficiency and like economic, like how the brain works to be economic, sort of like a machine. Like when he talks about heuristics, and I think about that a lot when we talk about cognitive science.
Yeah, so a lot of it is guided by this idea of efficiency, right? So this is something that we saw when we looked at cooperation, right? What's the most efficient, optimal thing to do? It can seem costly, but actually this is supposed to be a really efficient way forward and things like that. And you can kind of see him doing like local integration in a lot of places, right? He's like, we got this piece of data, and we got this piece of data, and we're going to stick them together, and hopefully they work to kind of tell us something new about the mind. So yeah, I think you can read Reddish with Marr in your mind, you can read Reddish with Tolman in your mind, with Turing, with Broadbent. A lot of the work that we've been doing so far kind of gets cashed out quite nicely in Reddish. So I just kind of, you know me, I have to kind of whack you guys over the head with that. But let's look at what Reddish actually has to say. So let's start with, okay, so the book starts by talking about a thermostat, which might in principle be weird. But what does he say about the thermostat? Like, what's the story that we're supposed to take away from this thermostat? And I'm gonna go with, let's see, Betsy. Why am I looking at a thermostat?
So basically he's saying that like the thermostat looks at what the temperature is in the room or whatever it's controlling and decides what needs to be done based on that. Like if the temperature is too high or too low, and then corrects its behavior to adjust the temperature of the room. So sort of about like the thermostat is perceiving its own environment, but he also says that there might be some like there could like maybe be a problem with its perception or something like that, and how that might affect its actions.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot bundled in there. I had a quick hand from Ava, I think, so I just turn to that, and then Philippe.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it is kind of modeling the predictive coding theory of it's just trying to minimize the error between the set point and what it's perceiving.
Yeah, exactly. So you're both right. So we have 3 ingredients that a thermostat needs, right? It needs a goal. It needs, what else? It needs to perceive the world as it actually is, right? And it needs to be able to act. Right? So I would never set a room to 75 because that's too cold. But let's say that we set the room to 85, which is like nice and balmy. So my goal, the thermostat, I'm now a thermostat apparently. My thermostat's goal is 85, right? So what does it mean for me to perceive the world? What am I perceiving? I'm going to go with grace. If my goal is 85, what is it that I need to perceive about the world?
You need to sense the temperature of what it actually is.
Yeah, and it turns out it's freezing in here, right? So I perceive that it's only 65 because My beloved dog is constantly going out on the porch, and thus the door is open and it's freezing, right? So my goal is 85. My perception is that it's 65. And Philippe, I still remember your hand, and Helen, I will come to you in 1 second. But first, I have to ask Arrington a question. Arrington, so my goal is 85. My perception is 65. What is my action?
You have to like heat up the room.
Yeah, I'm going to kickstart that boiler and heat it. Okay. Now, notice that this has a little bit of that retroactive structure, right? It's like, here's what I want. Oh no, here's where I am. I need to crank things up so that I separate the difference between what I want and how things actually are. And Ava's absolutely right. That's a feature that gets captured by predictive coding. The one thing that's a little bit different is the language of a goal. So reinforcement learning is pretty comfortable with using the word of having a goal. So the goal is 85. Predictive coding would just say, I predict that it's 85 and I perceive that it's 65 and minimize error that way. So it's just kind of a terminological difference. But yeah, those are kind of the main ideas there. Okay, so Philippe patiently had his hand up, and then I think Helen had her hand up as well.
Professor, do you know that story about the guy who faced a machine and then won, but then like died? It was like mining or something.
He was mining?
Yeah, it was like a mining competition between him and like a machine. It was like a folk tale.
So there are lots of cases of people playing computers now, but I don't think I'm familiar with that one. So I know that Gary Kasparov, for example, played Deep Blue and lost. That was the first time a computer beat someone at chess. But not in mining and not in real life. No, I haven't heard of that.
It's John Henry, and it was building a railroad.
Yeah, John Henry. My question was
building a railroad, but that's a different kind of machine, right? So that's no offense to trains, but trains are dumb.
Well, my question was, besides understanding how a machine works as a cognitive black box like we do, is it possible that machines can teach us about the idea of fatigue? Because when we usually have machines work for us, we usually have them work to where they don't have they don't feel fatigue. They just keep going on and on and on and on. And I was wondering if it had anything to do with the psyche of the human being, of how we get tired, even though we don't want to be tired. We want to keep going, but we have to stop and take breaks.
Yeah, I think we can definitely think about it. So if you think about why you feel fatigue, right, or you feel pain, one way that you can think about those things is that your body is trying to signal something to you, right? It's like, I'm running low on glucose, or I am getting a little bit stabbed in the foot by a rock and I'm not enjoying this, right? That's kind of, when it's working properly, that's what pain is, or that's what fatigue is. Of course, it can break down in lots of ways. But yeah, we can definitely learn a lot about our constraints and the signaling of those constraints from machines, because machines might not be wired to feel pain, and they probably oughtn't be wired that way. And they aren't wired to feel their computational constraints, and maybe they oughtn't be wired that way, although that one's more debatable. But we can certainly learn about what those constraints look like from machines, and then we can study that. And I'll just give you a brief example, and then Helen had her hand up as well. One of the things that we've been studying in cognitive science over the past 10 years or so is this idea of cognitive control. So how can I put my mind to just one task and not another? So for example, when you're doing the Stroop task, how can you make yourself read the word rather than identify the color? And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. One thing that we've learned from computers is that when we have tasks, they all reuse the same kind of resources or neural real estate. And we have models showing us from computers that when you have this reuse of real estate, it brings down how many tasks you can run in parallel down to 0 or 1 very quickly. And so we can get models from computers which can show us why we're so bad at certain kinds of multitasking and not at other kinds of multitasking, where again, we perceive fatigue, computers don't. So that's a huge issue. Happy to say more about that, but that would be kind of my quick response to that question. Helen?
I really couldn't get past this without clarification. But do you actually set your thermostat to 85 degrees?
I mean, I would if I could.
Oof.
But I'm not the only decision maker in residence. But yes, if I had the world my way, it would be a balmy 85 all the time. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we have here, any other questions about this real quick? So what we have here is a process of negative feedback, right? It's like, oh, that's not what I wanted. Now I'm going to change that, right? And so that should kind of become the familiar thought there, right? Now, Reddish also talks about vulnerabilities in diagnosis in terms of the thermostat. And what was the idea there? Why is it useful to know that the thermostat has 3 separate parts? I'm gonna go with, oh, Luis. Ayana, you are saved.
He says it's important because our brains function in the same way. They perceive, then they determine what to do, then they take an action, and so they can break down at each of those points, and we have to figure out at what point or where it's going wrong in order to understand how to fix it or where we should take the next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but I see a hand from Kiara.
So is negative feedback, sorry, I don't know if this was like for the like previous thing we were talking about. So is negative feedback just the difference between like you have your 85 that you want, but it's at 65? So the negative feedback is like the difference that you need to change?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like negative feedback can be for like pH, right? For any homeostatic regulation, it's like, here's where you should be, and here's where you are. Oh, crap. I need to adjust my blood sugar, or I need to adjust my body temperature, or, you know, I need my tummy to be full, or something like that, right? And all those processes seem to work by negative feedback. Again, back to who asked this question? Maybe Priya. Yeah, Priya asked this question. Back to this idea of like, rather than constantly monitoring where you are, it's like, well, just fix it when it's not where it's supposed to be, right? It's this idea of kind of information theoretic efficiency. But yeah, Luis is absolutely right. Understanding how something works is really important if things break down and you want to fix them. So understanding the kind of basic direction of goal, perceive, act, then gives us a kind of clue of like, okay, my thermostat is broken. And I can be like, well, did I set it wrong, right? Did someone set it to 55? Because that requires action, but it doesn't mean that the thermostat is broken, right? It means the goal is misset. Is it set to 85, but it really thinks it is 85 in here when really it's 40, right? Then it's a problem with its perception. Or the thermostat is set to 85, it perceives that it's 85, but the boiler is broken downstairs, and so the heat isn't kicking in, right? So when something breaks, we need to know which part of it is it's what's regulating. And think back, do you guys remember the example of the anorexia there? When we talked in predictive coding about how we can have a predictive coding account of anorexia, what are some of the ways that you can think of this kind of differential diagnosis in understanding what's going wrong in anorexia nervosa? Use the thermostat as an analogy. What are the 3 kind of points of vulnerability that you might think are breaking down in a case of anorexia? Kiara?
The perception. So you have like your actual goal, but your perceived goal is, or like perceived weight is more than what you actually are.
Yeah, so your goal weight is, let's just take me here, just because that's the easiest thing. So 135 pounds, right? But I perceive myself as being 150, right? And so my perception is off. My goal is fine. My perception is what's malfunctioning a little bit. What else can go wrong in that case? So perception can go wrong, but what else?
The bottom-up error signals.
Yeah, so in terms of perception, action, and goal, what can go wrong in anorexia?
You can have you can perceive the world correctly, but just have determined that you need to lose a lot of weight, so you can perceive to be 130, and yet you want to be 120. So the goal, according to like doctors, would be wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So I can read a lot of fashion magazines and think, well, I'm 5'10", so I should probably weigh 115 pounds. Now I correctly perceive myself as weighing 135, so my perception is fine, but my representation of the goal is incorrect. And this will happen, right? If you use like MyFitnessPal or something like that, they'll tell you like you're setting your goal weight as too low because the goal you were setting is unhealthy given your height and your age or something like that. Helen, you had a hand up on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say that like when you're talking about like what can go wrong with anorexia is also like how the mind decides to exercise control over not just like oneself, but how you try to control like the environment around you can start to get skewed.
Yeah, so your goal can be fine, your perception can be fine, and your action can be not fine, right? Or it can be some combination of the above, but we can say something like, well, okay, supposing you go back to the example of the thermostat, you want to heat the house. What would be an inappropriate course of action on the part of the thermostat to heat the house?
Setting it up to a lower temperature.
Yeah, okay, so changing the temperature, turning on the air conditioning is a bad way of heating the house, turns out. What's another really bad way to heat your house?
Overcompensating and like turning the dial like at a very high temperature.
Yeah, or lighting your house on fire. Really bad way of heating your house. And this is actually something that part of my research is in, is how do we make sure computers do what we want them to do and not what they think we want them to do, right? So I tell my computer, heat my house, and my computer's like, fine, here's a match. It'll be super warm, right? It'll be super warm. And it's not wrong, like it's doing what I asked it to do, but it's doing it to a degree and in a way that I really don't appreciate, right? And we call this problem hard optimization. And so that's something that people worry about in artificial intelligence a lot, because I know that burning my house down is a bad way to heat the house, but my computer might not. And a lot of AI now deals with how to make sure that your AI doesn't misunderstand you. Conversely, a lot of understanding what goes wrong in the mind goes through this process of differential diagnosis and says, is it the goal that's misfiring? Is it the perception that's misfiring? Or is it the action that's misfiring? For example, in the case of anorexia or depression or anxiety or something like that. Okay. Okay. So is there a hand on this? Sorry. Philippe, sorry, I didn't see you there.
So when I'm listening to you or other students in the class talk about bottom-up processing, the visualization that comes in my mind is the visual system, starting from the rods and the cones to the action and perception, where, what pathways. Is there anything else I need to think about when understanding predictive coding from a bottom-up perspective than just that, increasing neural awareness of the visual scene?
Yeah, so there's another variable typically in predictive coding models. We mentioned this really briefly last class, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but bottom-up error signals also come with a measure of uncertainty. So how seriously should I take a given bottom-up signal? And this is the precision measure that we talked about. And just kind of briefly as an aside, when it's daylight, how seriously should you take prediction error signals coming through your visual system? When it's broad daylight, how reliable are your eyes?
Pretty reliable.
Joe's giving me a thumbs up, and she would be correct, right? Like most of you are pretty good at seeing, last I checked. Anybody out there not a good seer?
Without these, I'm not that good.
I mean, I'm like super blind, but like, all things considered, I'm capable of seeing. Turn the light switch off. Should you put a lot of weight in the error signals coming from the visual system? No, right? Because in the dark, it's not worth much. So precision, the precision measure of visual error signaling will go way down in the dark. And what will typically go up? Which sensory modality goes up in the dark?
Hearing.
Hearing, right? We automatically switch to what we hear rather than what we see when we hit the lights. And predictive coding argues that that is a function of our precision, which suggests that vision is not reliable in the dark. So there's a high uncertainty measure, and audition is a lot more certain in the dark, and vice versa, right? So yeah, predictive coding does have this added wrinkle of precision, but I don't want to get too much into that because it can get really complicated in terms of how guys acted. I'm happy to post some reading about it on Slack or something like that. Noah had actually asked me about that as well. Any other questions about the thermostat? Okay, you're all thermostat experts now. Okay, so here's where we're gonna kind of shift to chapter 3, and we have a few more minutes, so we just kind of take a crack at it. So at the beginning, I suggested that we had the conceptual level description of reinforcement learning, and that instead of going to the neural level, we're actually going to start at kind of the behavioral target phenomenon, and then next class we're going to see how the neural mechanisms explain our economic and decision-making behavior. Right? So the way that Reddish actually starts is he kind of says, okay, here's our target. What we're trying to explain is human decision-making, and human decision-making at the behavioral or kind of psychological and economic level. And what he tells us is basically that we are very weird when it comes to how we make decisions, right? So one thing to flag here is that we have a reinforcement learning definition of reward and value. So intrinsic, intrinsically desirable and leading up to what is intrinsically desirable. But now when we're talking about Reddish, we're talking about value as in what is the worth of something. So just be careful because here you have an integration problem. These two disciplines use the word value in different ways. Okay?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, here, let's see if I can pull up the, I'm trying to get the, there we go. So let me, okay, so I want to just be careful because I know the integration problem seemed really boring when we were doing it as kind of a conceptual feature of cognitive science, but this is a prime case where it comes up. So in one discipline, we have reinforcement learning, and we have reward, and we have value, right? And in this case, reward here is something like the coffee, and value is all the things I have to do to get to the cup of coffee, right? So we had two differences here. Now, in economics, which is the discipline that David comes from, or specifically he's a neuroeconomist, he looks at the neural pathways underlying our economic decision-making. When he uses the word value, he means how much money, for example, would you be willing to pay for a cup of coffee? Or how much effort would you be willing to put into a cup of coffee? Or how much pain would you be willing to suffer in order to get a cup of coffee? And so on, right? Now, this and this and this notion are very closely related. Because depending on how much reward or value I attribute to something over here, this is how much money or time or effort I'm willing to put into it over here. But I just want to point out that on the face of it, the notion of value here and the notion of value here is slightly different, even though they're like really closely related concepts. Does that make sense? Perfect. Any other questions about that? Okay, so why are we weird about value? Like, what are some examples of having weird approaches to value? Like, what's our target system that we're trying to explain? We're super weird in how we value things. What are some examples from Reddish about how weird we are? I'll give you a cartoon to kind of, let me erase that. What are some of the strange patterns that we see in human decision making, according to Reddish?
We're super inconsistent.
Okay,
Like
we're super inconsistent.
how we value things, and language and the rhetoric to describe options really changes how we react.
Yeah, so we're super inconsistent. And sometimes that makes sense, right? Because having a cup of coffee in the morning seems amazing. Having a cup of coffee at midnight sounds downright terrible. That's fine. But other ones, as Ashley mentioned, are really irrational. And so take a second to read this Dilbert comic and see if you can remember what this effect is called.
Endowment effect.
Yeah, so it's partly the endowment effect and partly the fact that we're very sensitive to loss, right? So he doesn't want to give up the job he already has, no matter how bad it is. And he places a lot more emphasis on something's cost than he does on something's gain. And these are two very reliable features of human decision making that, from an economic perspective, we want to understand. Similarly, we know that drugs of addiction really hijack how we value things. So one of the examples that we saw, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next class, is that people are willing to give up $1,000 in order to get some cocaine, but they'll give away their cocaine for just a $3 movie ticket, right? And the question is, why are there these kind of inconsistencies in decision making? So what we're going to do next class is we're going to kind of look at it at the behavioral level, but we're also going to start diving into the neural level, taking what we know from reinforcement learning, but also starting to look at the reward pathways in the brain and how they get affected in addiction to kind of get an understanding of how our decision-making systems work. That's all the time that we have for today, but we'll kind of continue from here. And if you have any questions or something like that, just drop me a line on Slack. But otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.